Welcome to This Week in Psychiatry. This week we're covering 7 notable papers spanning psychedelic and trauma-focused psychotherapy trials, the hard problem of scaling and prevention when interventions are simplified or delivered universally, and new biological work on psychosis in the brain. Let's dive in. We start with 2 randomized trials that test intensive, targeted therapies in difficult populations. In Nature Medicine, Rucker and colleagues report a double-blind, placebo-controlled feasibility trial of a single 25 milligram dose of psilocybin with psychological preparation, dosing support and integration, delivered inside a single National Health Service site in England. 60 adults with major depressive disorder who had not responded adequately to at least 2 antidepressant treatments were randomized 1-to-1, and 59 of 60 completed all follow-up depression ratings, which is remarkable retention for this population. The primary outcomes were feasibility measures, recruitment, retention, and variance estimation, but the between-group difference on the Montgomery-Åsberg scale at 3 weeks favored psilocybin by roughly 10 points, a large effect that was still present at 6 weeks. Adverse events were non-serious in both arms, though more numerous with psilocybin. The important framing for practice is that this is a feasibility study supporting a future confirmatory trial, not a licensing trial, but it does demonstrate that psilocybin-assisted therapy can be delivered within a public healthcare system rather than only in specialist research units. Alongside that, JAMA Psychiatry publishes a multi-site trial of impact of killing therapy, an individual psychotherapy for veterans whose post-traumatic stress is bound up with having killed in war or feeling responsible for others' deaths. 100 veterans across 3 Veterans Affairs systems were randomized to impact of killing or present-centered therapy. Both groups improved in psychosocial functioning, and on the World Health Organization quality of life measure, there was no significant difference between the 2 treatments. But on the Sheehan Disability Scale, impact of killing produced significantly greater improvement in work, social and family functioning, a moderate effect, and it also outperformed present-centered therapy on post-traumatic stress and moral injury symptoms. So for the veteran who describes guilt about killing rather than fear of danger, a moral injury-focused protocol appears to add something beyond good supportive care. The second theme is less comfortable. What happens when we try to scale psychological treatment or push it upstream into prevention? The Lancet Psychiatry reports a Bayesian component network meta-analysis of individual participant data from 30 trials and more than 10,000 participants receiving task-shared psychosocial interventions for depression and anxiety delivered by non-specialists. By dismantling interventions into their constituent elements, Popola and colleagues found that strengthening social support carried the largest incremental benefit, followed by behavioral activation and problem management. More provocatively, relaxation was associated with a clearly detrimental effect, and cognitive reframing with a less certain but still detrimental signal when added to these brief non-specialist packages. Component effects also varied by baseline severity and sociodemographic characteristics, and the authors provide a free web application for personalized estimates. That doesn't mean relaxation or cognitive restructuring are harmful in expert hands. It means that in lay-delivered, brief formats, loading on social support, activation, and practical problem-solving may be the better bet. 2 other trials this week show scaling failing outright. In psychotherapy and psychosomatics, the GIVE-3 trial randomized 135 patients with psychosis across 3 National Health Service sites to guided self-help cognitive behavioral therapy for distressing voices delivered by briefly trained assistant psychologists, plus usual care versus usual care alone. Voice-related distress differences at 16 and 28 weeks favored the intervention numerically but were not statistically significant, and the authors conclude the intervention was not clinically effective when delivered by briefly trained staff. And in the British Journal of Psychiatry, the AWARE cluster randomized trial enrolled over 12,000 Year 9 pupils across 153 English secondary schools to compare youth aware of mental health, the Mental Health and High School Curriculum Guide, and usual practice. Youth aware of mental health produced no improvement in depressive symptoms, and a notable minority of schools could not deliver it at all. The guide did modestly increase intended help seeking, but at longer-term follow-up, depressive symptom scores were higher in both intervention arms than in control, a possible iatrogenic signal that led the investigators to advise further investigation before wider rollout in English schools. Taken together with the component analysis, the message is that fidelity, therapist training, and content selection are not administrative details. They determine whether a scaled intervention works, does nothing, or possibly harms. Finally, 2 papers in molecular psychiatry reframe psychosis biologically. Kubota and colleagues scanned 37 patients with late-onset psychosis and 47 age-matched controls using amyloid and tau positron emission tomography with a tracer sensitive to a broad range of tau pathologies. Roughly a third of patients were amyloid positive and about 2/3 were tau positive, compared with 2% and 15% of controls. Increased tau retention in the parietal cortex persisted even when analysis was restricted to amyloid-negative patients, and among amyloid-positive patients, greater parietal tau burden tracked with worse frontal executive performance. Practically, this strengthens the case for taking cognitive assessment and neurodegenerative workup seriously in first-episode psychosis in later life. In the same journal, Connolly and colleagues targeted the default mode network with theta burst stimulation in schizophrenia. In a 5-session accelerated course of continuous theta burst stimulation, processing speed improved in the schizophrenia group, reductions in default mode network connectivity correlated with those gains, and younger participants benefited more. The samples are small, 29 participants in the multi-session study, so this is early proof of concept for personalized network-targeted stimulation of cognitive deficits, not a clinical service yet. If you only have time for one paper this week, make it the Lancet Psychiatry Component Network meta-analysis of task-shared psychosocial interventions. It is the paper most likely to change what you actually put inside a brief intervention or supervise a non-specialist to deliver, and its detrimental signal for relaxation deserves your attention. Here are the key takeaways from this week in psychiatry. First, psilocybin-assisted therapy was feasible and showed a large symptom difference in a public healthcare setting, but this was a feasibility trial, and confirmatory data are still pending. Second, for veterans distressed by killing, a moral injury-focused therapy beat present-centered therapy on disability, post-traumatic stress, and moral injury, though not on quality of life. Third, in brief non-specialist interventions, prioritize social support, behavioral activation, and problem management, and be cautious about relaxation. Fourth, 2 scaling attempts failed. Guided self-help for voices delivered by briefly trained assistants was not effective, and universal school programs produced no depression benefit with a longer-term worsening signal. Fifth, in late-onset psychosis, tau pathology is common enough that neurodegeneration belongs in your differential. That's your roundup for This Week in Psychiatry. The full transcript and references are available on the episode page in your Audio Scholar library. This is an AI-curated summary. For clinical decisions, always consult primary sources and current guidelines. See you next week. If this weekly briefing is useful, follow the show in your podcast app so new episodes arrive automatically. And if you have a paper you have been meaning to read, upload the PDF or paste any link at audioscholar.cc. We will turn it into audio like this one, in any of 31 languages. This is an automated summary generated by artificial intelligence, which can make mistakes. Always review the original source materials.